We've chosen the term competitive statecraft, but whatever term you prefer, we're here because we all recognize that we need new approaches to achieve better strategic outcomes from our foreign policy efforts than what we've got in recent years. And I know we're all united in our commitment from whatever little corner of influence we occupy to the hard thought and the hard work it will take to get them.
So, General, I was wondering whether you might just tell us what would be your definition of what competitive statecraft actually entails.
In terms of competitive statecraft, strategic competence, one of the ways I think that we become more competent is that the American people demand a higher degree of competence in the areas of foreign policy and national security. And ASU is the perfect place to engage the next generation, several generations removed from us maybe, in the areas of national security and foreign policy. But I think the emphasis is on the word competitive, which gets to the interactive nature of diplomacy, the interactive nature of really advancing our national security interests. I think for too often, especially since the end of the Cold War, we didn't recognize the continuous interaction with enemies, rivals, and adversaries. And as a result, we assumed that maybe there was linear progress, right, toward a world in which great power competition was a relic of the past. And that undermines our strategic competence. If you don't recognize the competitive nature of foreign policy and national security, first of all, if you're not in the arena, you're going to get your ass kicked, right? I mean, so if you're not on the field itself because you vacated it. But also, it's really the recognition of the interaction with enemies, rivals, and adversaries, which requires a strategy. If you're just going to do something linear, if you're just going to build a bridge, you just need a plan. If you are engaged in a competition with a determined and capable adversary or rival, you need a strategy. So I think competitive statecraft is the right term, and statecraft, I think, alludes to an element of, I think, what we're going to talk about a little bit as well, which is what is strategic competence, which is, I think, the ability to integrate all elements of national power and efforts of like-minded partners in a way that is synergistic and allows you to advance and protect your interests, to overcome obstacles to progress, and take advantage of opportunities. So, I mean, I think all of that's a lot, right? It's a lot to overcome, and I think we've seen it even more body blows with the assault on the first branch of government on January 6th, George Floyd's murder and the violent aftermath. I mean, it's a lot of blows in that period of time. So I think our confidence is shaken, and I think there has to be a deliberate effort on the part of our leadership, but not even wait for our political class to do this, to regain our confidence in our democratic principles, institutions, and processes. But I do think that it's a false choice. I think it's a false choice. I think that we can't afford to not invest in our defense capabilities because, as we've learned, I hope, from the reinvasion of Ukraine a year ago today, is that it's much cheaper to prevent a war, than to fight one. I think the lead from behind narrative was not helpful. I think the pivot out of the Middle East was not helpful because, hey, of course, we all realize this. There are really consequential competitions playing out in the Middle East that are quite relevant to the competition with Russia and China. And it's our proclamation over and over again, hey, we're leaving. Hey, now we're really leaving. We never actually really leave the Middle East, but by saying that, what we do is we encourage hedging behavior among even our friends and partners. And you see this happening with the Emiratis and the Saudis and others right now, is that this vacuum, this perception of the U.S. leaving, has allowed Russia to portray itself, play the role of both arsonist and fireman in the region, and of course they're hedging. These countries are hedging with China as well in terms of investments and arms procurements and drone procurements and so forth. I do think that the narrative has been off a bit on their part, with the president and some other senior officials, in connection with playing into Putin's hands, right? By highlighting the concerns about nuclear escalation or an escalation of the conflict, because this is all Putin has left, is to rattle his nuclear saber. I don't believe a nuclear weapon is usable in Ukraine. I think he knows that he is the person who should fear escalation the most. And actually, remember what he said, hey, if NATO convoys bring in equipment to the Ukrainians, I'm going to do something really bad. Okay, well, what did he do? Nothing. The Lithuanian army could march on St. Petersburg right now. 97% of the Russian army is in Ukraine.
So this that's a fascinating concept, because I'm just trying to put my mind through this. The Lithuanian army.
I'm not saying that they should. I'm just saying that I think Putin realizes that he's in a position of weakness. On strategic empathy, though, I do think that some of the most significant deficiencies in our policies and strategies, our approaches to our most significant national security challenges, were due to a lack of strategic empathy, or what I call strategic narcissism in the book, which is a tendency to believe that what we choose to do or choose not to do is decisive toward achieving a favorable outcome. So we think, okay, well, maybe if we just allay Putin's security concerns, you know, that everything will be okay. You know, maybe if we tamp down the temperature with the China relationship, you know, that Xi Jinping will behave in a fundamentally different way. Or maybe if we remove sanctions on the Iranian regime, that the Iranian regime will fundamentally change. And I think the problem is this lack of strategic empathy, and in particular, the paying attention to the emotions, the aspirations, and the ideologies that drive and constrain the other. And so Putin is, I think, a man who is obsessed. He's obsessed with a drive to restore Russia to national greatness. And he's driven mainly by a sense of honor lost during the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then I do think psychology comes into it, right? I think he's he's a street thug, he's a bully, and a coward, all wrapped up into one. And I think when you think about your adversary, you have to take all of that into consideration.
You've criticized the administration for using the term integrated deterrence to create what you call the illusion that better coordinated policies can be substituted for modernized, ready, forward-positioned forces, the argument that you've just made a moment ago. So I hear you, but couldn't integrated deterrence also be seen more positively as an integration in the context of competitive statecraft, of referring to employing whole-of-government assets to achieve national goals? Couldn't one put a positive spin on that too? But give me your criticism first.
No, I would say I agree. There is, I mean, how about, you know, disintegrated deterrence is not good, right? And we know that. And we know that we work at cross purposes between different departments and agencies. I've witnessed that, you know. But that doesn't work really well either. Integration is really important. And but I was criticizing what the magical quality it appears to have in the national defense strategy, and that it in and of itself can substitute for, you know, a force that's fully modernized. We have a force that has deferred a lot of modernization, you know, based on the wars that we're fighting. We had the problem with the Budget Control Act and the you know, not being able to have multi-year budgeting, predictable budgets. We held on to too many legacy and too much costly equipment and haven't replaced it. We have developed but have not yet fielded countermeasures to the PLA's countermeasures that we've seen them fielding in terms of tiered and layered air defense, counter-satellite capabilities, offensive cyber, electromagnetic warfare, drone and swarm drone. Those, you know, war's a continuous interaction of opposites, right, within wars, but in between wars as well, in terms of how militaries develop and field capabilities, and we're behind in that. And then I think our joint force is just too darn small. You know, I mean, if you look at the forces that we're deploying, these little penny packets, you know, into Europe or in the Pacific, I mean, what are they really going to do in a crisis? I mean, not enough, I don't think. And so we don't have enough ships or air wings, and I think the Army's too small. And of course, we have a recruiting issue we could talk about now as well, and maybe where that's coming from. But I really am concerned that we are not investing enough now to deter a conflict, or to be able to respond really in sufficient scale and for ample duration to fight and win. And when you look at the service secretary's strategies and priorities, it's really hard. I mean, you might even forget a little bit like what that service is for when you read them. You know, and so I think that this should be like a wake-up call with not only what's happening in Ukraine and with Russia, but also the nature of the China-Russia relationship and the degree to which that partnership without limits is connected to other nefarious actors. So, you know, George Marshall said, hey, the problem is when you have the time, you don't have the money. And then when you have the money, you don't have the time. So I think we have to make some tough calls now and invest more in defense. Be the degree to which that really like-minded partners managed Putin's ability, overcame Putin's desire to use energy for coercive purposes. And they had some good luck with a relatively mild winter in Europe up to this point, but there are also a lot of some really big adjustments made to energy supply chains. This is an area where I think the United States could have done a heck of a lot more by expediting permitting and for the U.S. to export more oil and natural gas. So what's happened is, I think, mainly because of the desire to reduce carbon emissions. What's happened is nonsensical policies, right? Where instead of us pumping that oil and exporting that gas, we've supplicated to the Venezuelans and the Iranians and asked them to pump more gas. I mean, how's that helpful? And then of course, because of the shortage of gas, there's a lot more coal burning going on as well, which is actually increasing carbon emissions. So I think an opportunity is now to integrate efforts to reduce carbon emissions with an energy security perspective and through the lens of national security. And I think there's some solutions readily available to do that. And then, of course, the other area that we've become aware of that is quite significant, especially if tensions increase with China, is supply chain resilience overall, and the degree to which it's a bad idea to have single points of failure for critical supply chains that run through authoritarian regimes. And I think the administration is doing a good job assessing those supply chains, working with allies and partners to friendshore, to use the Treasury Secretary's word for it. And I think that all that momentum is really important. If you just look at really what's happened in the most recent export controls associated with microprocessor manufacturing hardware, I mean, our allies and partners went along with us, and from the Netherlands and Japan. That's, as you know, that's a lot of hard diplomatic work to make that happen. So I do think that the administration is doing a very good job in these areas. The scale of this problem is bigger than any of the man hours, woman hours that they have to dedicate to it. So it's going to be an uphill climb. But I do think that the tools of economic statecraft, including CFIUS, or the inbound investment screening to ensure that Chinese and other companies can't take small stakes or majority stakes in U.S. companies that have sensitive technologies, the outbound investment screening to ensure that we're not underwriting our own demise, export controls on key dual technology or defense-related areas is really critical. Investment in our own competitive advantages in key areas, like you saw with the CHIPS Act, areas where China is trying to weaponize its mercantilist statist economic model against us, and to compensate for that. I think you're going to have to see a lot more of that, along with what isn't talked about enough, deregulation and permitting reform. Right, it takes 20 years to open a mine in the United States, right? I mean, if you want to build a lot of batteries, man, you better open some mines. I mean, and we can get some from other sources as well, not necessarily in the continental United States, but we have to be more agile there. And then, of course, you have the human capital aspects of this. I mean, it would be great to have a debate about immigration reform in context of the national security imperative to make it easier for people to work in the United States and to get a path to citizenship. I mean, it's our greatest differential advantage, I mean, I'm at Stanford University, and I see some of my students, international students, they can't get a visa in the United States. These are like engineering grads from Stanford, and then they're going to Canada to get visas there. It's nutty. So I think that there's a whole range of human capital aspects of this as well, but all of this is, I would say, all this is economic statecraft. And when you say, when you look at an integrated approach or strategic competence, it's how do you make sure that all these tools that you're employing are mutually reinforcing and not working at cross purposes with one another.
You sat right there at the fulcrum of coordinating U.S. national security strategy. You were the guy who had all this sort of White House imprimatur to go ahead and make this thing happen. Why are we so, and I don't mean to cast any aspersions, why are we so relatively poor at integrating all these elements which exist in our capacity but are never really sort of coming together to achieve the impact that we're seeking to gain? What's our problem?
I was walking down Walnut Street, my phone rings, and it's the White House saying, hey, can you go to Mar-a-Lago and interview for the job of National Security Advisor? I flew down there on a Sunday, had my first interview, then a second interview on Monday. The president hired me. I flew back on Air Force One. They had Ospreys bring me back to my home in Tidewater, Virginia, Fort Eustis, Virginia. And then I packed a bag and went to work the next day, like Tuesday afternoon. I mean, so there was not a lot of prep time. But what I was really, you know, grateful for was the Army giving me the ability to study history and to write a dissertation that became a book about how and why Vietnam became an American war, in which I criticized McGeorge Bundy, my predecessor, several times removed, for running an ineffective national security decision-making and policy-making process. And so when I walked into that office, it was quite a strange feeling, saying, "Okay, man, now you're responsible for that process you criticized." So I decided to at least try not to make the same mistakes.
Yep, so you've talked around it, but in all seriousness, given the size of our government, the bureaucracy of our government, and given the divisiveness in our government, is competitive statecraft, is this ability to craft a strategy and a campaign plan against the interagency actually achievable? And if it is, how do we get there?
Okay, I think it is, and I think China is going to be the test case. There's a great deal of bipartisan support across the Trump administration and the Biden administration. Like, how often do you hear that, right? And I would say also on Russia, in terms of just the concrete actions the Trump administration took and what the Biden administration is taking, there's a great deal of continuity. I think that the Iranians are going to force a great deal of continuity, in terms of the approach to Iran as well. So, I do think it's possible. And one of the good things about bureaucratic inertia is if you get a really good idea into the bureaucracy, it's going to take you a really long time to kill it.